All right. Here we go. Chapter 15. The Book of Benjamin. The son and heir of King Mosiah I is better known King Benjamin, whose final sermon is presented in great detail in the opening chapters of our Book of Mosiah and the first pages of the renewed translation of the Book of Mormon. Despite the prominence he holds in the Book of Mormon, what we readily know of Benjamin's early life is described only skeletally in the small plates, Book of Omni and Words of Mormon. Benjamin's story is, in some ways, an extension of his father's story. Changes that Mosiah I initiated, Benjamin perpetuated. Mosiah I relocated the center of Nephite life from Nephi to Zarahemla. Benjamin continued to live in Zarahemla. Mosiah I united the Nephites and the Mulekites under the rule of a new dynasty. Benjamin ruled over that united kingdom as his father's successor in that dynasty. Mosiah I initiated a reformation of Nephite religion. Benjamin continued this reformation and extended it. One reflection of that legacy of religious reformation may be in Benjamin's name, which derives ultimately from the son of Jacob, Israel, and Rachel, the younger brother of the biblical Joseph, to whom the Nephites traced their genealogy, and which means the son of the right hand. For the biblical Benjamin's birth, see Genesis 35, 16 through 20. With this meaning, the name Benjamin connected back in various ways to how the motif of the right hand had appeared in the Hebrew Bible and reached forward to how it would appear in the New Testament, in the Restoration and in Benjamin's own late life's teaching. In the story of Jacob/Israel, in the story of Jacob/Israel, blessing Joseph's sons, being the right-hand son, was associated with being a chosen birthright heir. That's Genesis 48, 13 through 18. In Stephen's vision in the New Testament, Acts 7, 55 through 56, and in Joseph Smith's theophanies at the theophanies at the head of the Restoration, e.g. Doctrine and Covenants 76, 24, Jesus Christ, the Messiah, stood at the Father's right hand as his son. Footnote, note that the motif of the right hand was also significant in the Josian Reform and in the echoes of that reform in the latter-day Restoration. See 2 Chronicles 34:2 and Doctrine and Covenants 3, 1 through 2. There we are. As his father's name had anticipated the Messiah and pointed to him, Benjamin's own name also anticipated the Christ, in giving his people a name before his death and teaching them the meaning of that name. Benjamin built on the meaning of the name he had been given at birth. Not only was Benjamin a son of the right hand, in similitude of the Christ, the only begotten Son, Moses 1:6, all who would live fully in covenant relationship with the Lord would bear the name of Christ and stand at his right hand as his chosen sons and daughters. And now, because of this covenant which ye have made, ye shall be called the children of Christ, his sons and his daughters. Therefore I would that ye should take upon you the name of Christ, all you that have entered into the covenant with God, that ye should be obedient unto the end of your lives. And it shall come to pass that whosoever doeth this shall be found at the right hand of God, for he shall know the name by which he is called, for he shall be called by the name of Christ. Mosiah 5, 7 through 9. In giving his son this name, Mosiah I continued to point his people toward Christ long after his own death. Benjamin would then extend this further by naming his son Mosiah. The incomplete book of Mosiah. Clues in the published Book of Mormon indicate that our Book of Mosiah is missing its original first 2 chapters that likely contained early narratives of Benjamin's reign. The clue to the existence of these missing chapters is located where Mormon's abridgment resumes, right after the lost pages end, in the opening verse of the Book of Mosiah. This chapter begins with Benjamin's reign already in progress, thus catching the narrative in midstream. Quote, "And now there was no more contention in all the land of Zarahemla among all the people who belonged to King Benjamin, so that King Benjamin had continual peace all the remainder of his days." That's Mosiah 1:1. This present opening of the Book of Mosiah even begins grammatically in midstream, starting with the word "and." It refers back to earlier narratives of contention in all the land during Benjamin's reign, noting that while Benjamin's final people had conflicts early on, this was followed by a substantial period of continual peace, during which there was no more contention. This abrupt entry into the detailed story of Benjamin's reign, after only quick references in Omni in the Words of Mormon, indicate that the Book of Mosiah's true beginning, containing the earlier narrative and conflicts of Benjamin's reign, is missing. There are further clues pointing to the published Book of Mormon missing the original chapters of Mosiah. First, the Book of Mosiah in the printer's manuscript initially lacked a title. Instead, just prior to its publication, Oliver Cowdery inserted one for the book, labeling it the Book of Mosiah. Footnote: Oliver Cowdery's superlinear edition of the title, the Book of Mosiah, and his associated change of the chapter number discussed below are visible in the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon, circa August 1829, circa January 1830. Interesting. The reason for this can be identified from the chapter's position in the translation sequence. Although Mosiah follows the small plates in the printer's manuscript and published Book of Mormon, the first chapter of the present Book of Mosiah is the point at which Joseph Smith resumed the translation after the manuscript loss. The small plates portion that replaced the lost manuscript would not be translated until the end. Sorry, I'm thinking about the timing of that. I'm wondering if that means that Mormon, who was actually doing the abridgments and such, decided to add the small plates of Nephi just at the very end. I mean, which would make the most sense. So, let's see here. The lack of a title and need for Oliver to later add one suggests that Joseph Smith and Martin Harris had already translated the beginning of the book, including the original title, and that it was almost certainly in the lost manuscript. Second, the Book of Mosiah not only lacked a title, it also lacked another opening feature that characterizes all other books in Mormon's abridgment: an initial notation before the main body of the text that usually identifies the book's first record keeper and summarizes its content. For example, the Book of Alma opens with the Book of Alma, the son of Alma, an account of Alma, who was the son of Alma, the first chief judge over the people of Nephi, and also the high priest over the church, an account of the reign of judges and the wars and contentions among the people, and also an account of the war between the Nephites and the Lamanites according to the record of Alma, the first and chief judge. The lack of any similar notation at the beginning of the Book of Mosiah again suggests that the earliest portion of the book was part of the lost manuscript. Third, the book's present title, the Book of Mosiah, fails to match the pattern of how Mormon named the books in his abridgment, all of which bear the name of the first record keeper during the period covered by the book, and not the name of the main record keeper during that period. The Book of Helaman, for example, is named after Alma II's grandson, Helaman II, who kept the record for the period covered by its first 3 chapters, Helaman 1 through 3, and not for Helaman II's son, Nephi, who kept the record for the period covered by the remaining 13 chapters. That's Helaman 4 through 16. Applying the title The Book of Mosiah to a book that began while Benjamin was the keeper of the records departs from Mormon's convention. Footnote. It could be posited that the Book of Mosiah was named for Mosiah I. This would resolve the anomaly of Oliver not naming the book after Benjamin, but only at the price of creating a still larger anomaly, as documented in chapter 14. The importance of Mosiah I as a figure within Nephite history is enormous, and the volume of evidence for what was in his narrative in the lost manuscript is exceptionally high, by far the highest for any post-Nephi narrative in that manuscript. For the missing first 2 chapters of the Book of Mosiah I to have been contained in the two narratives of conflict from Benjamin's reign related below, and to have contained the entire narrative of Mosiah I, would have required those chapters to have been anomalously large, rivaling in size the books within Mormon's abridgment. If the book's original title was lost and forgotten along with the lost manuscript, then Oliver would have had to provide some title for the book as it went to press. Let me finish reading this paragraph, and then we'll come back to the footnote that's right here. So he had to provide some title for the book as it went to press. Selecting a name based on the identity of the primary ruler and chief record keeper for the period covered by the book may have seemed fitting choice to Oliver, but it was not the choice Mormon would have made, given the pattern of his other writings. Instead, the title Mormon gave our Book of Mosiah was likely the Book of Benjamin, named after that volume's initial record keeper. All right, now for the footnote. This is a big one. Well, this and 6 too, but anyways. When adding the name to this book on the printer's manuscript, Oliver likely did not get the name from Joseph Smith. The addition was made above the line, and thus, as noted on Joseph Smith Paper's website, possibly inserted after the time of the original inscription. Oliver would not have needed to add a title to this book until it was being prepared for typesetting around mid-October of 1829, at which time Joseph was hundreds of miles away in Pennsylvania. The title's failure to align with Mormon's naming practices and the evidence about the size and significance of Mosiah I's narrative strongly suggests that Oliver selected the name for the book. For the chronology of the typesetting, see Royal Skousen. Why was 1/6 of the 1830 Book of Mormon set from the original manuscript? That's pages 93 through 103. Interesting. Fourth, the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mosiah lacks a chapter 1 and chapter 2. Instead, it oddly begins with chapter 3. To adjust for this missing material, Oliver crossed out part of the Roman numeral chapter numbering, changing chapter 3 to chapter... Since it's using the Roman numerals, it has the other 2 crossed out. So it looks like IH on how it's crossed out on the typeset here, but you can see what he's talking about. Which then became in print chapter 1. Given that the Book of Mormon's original chaptering system, later revised in 1876, used chapters twice the length of present chapters, we can estimate that the present Book of Mormon is missing the equivalent of about 4 chapters of our present version from the early reign of King Benjamin. Ooh, that I did not know. That is interesting. Where did I miss that footnote? I'm going to read this other footnote because I missed where there it was. It was, which came to print as chapter 1. So the footnote for that says, while acknowledging that there were missing chapters of our Book of Mosiah, Brant Gardner posits that Oliver Cowdery may have initially assigned this chapter the number 3, continuing this numbering from the Book of Omni, being labeled chapter 1 and the Words of Mormon being labeled chapter 2, D. However, the crucial question here is the order in which these labels were assigned. The numbering of chapter 3 is logically prior to Oliver's confused numbering of the Words of Mormon as chapter 2.D, because, as Gardner notes, 1, chapter 2.D was later added intrusively above the line, and 2, Oliver did not initially perceive the Words of Mormon as a distinct unit, either book or a chapter, but merely a part of the Book of Omni, chapter 1. This means Joseph Smith did not, per his usual practice, indicate a chapter break at this point in the translation. Oliver thus would not have had any reason to enumerate the Words of Mormon as a separate chapter until he encountered chapter 3 at the end of the Words of Mormon. The Words of Mormon were thus assigned chapter 2.D because the succeeding text had been designated chapter 3, and not the other way around. See Brand A. Gardner, When Hypotheses Collide, responding to Lynn and Minson's When Pages Collide. Whew! Golly, these guys who get to original sources and dig up stuff, they dig in. That's awesome. This is a new subsection. Benjamin's Lost Narratives. Despite missing the original first 2 chapters of the Book of Mosiah or Book of Benjamin, clues in the present first chapter point to what preceded it. For example, the published Book of Mosiah begins, and now there was no more contention in all the land of Zarahemla among all the people who belonged to King Benjamin, so that King Benjamin had continual peace all the remainder of his days. That's Mosiah 1:1. Much can be teased out from this wording. From the first verse of our Book of Mosiah 1, we can see that prior material in the missing pages dealt with contention located in the land of Zarahemla among the people who belonged to King Benjamin. The words contention in Mormon's abridgment generally connotes a tense dispute rather than a military conflict, although the former often leads to the latter. Footnote: for example, in Alma 19:28, contention is used to describe the dispute in the previous verses over whether Ammon was the Great Spirit sent by the Great Spirit or was a monster sent by the Nephites. That's verses 25 through 27. Despite the severity of the contention, the narrative gives no indication of it turning violent. There we are. And the text here implies that the contention that occurred among Benjamin's people in Zarahemla was an internal conflict between them. In the small plates, Mormon opens his account of Benjamin's reign with such a conflict, and now concerning this King Benjamin, he had somewhat contentions among his own people. That's Words of Mormon 1:12. Mormon further and separately notes that Benjamin dealt with an external military conflict between Benjamin's people and the Lamanites, but he distinguishes that martial conflict with the earlier internal contention by introducing it with also as an additional controversy. Quote, and it came to pass also that the armies of the Lamanites came down out of the land of Nephi to battle against his people. But behold, King Benjamin gathered together his armies, and did stand against them. And he did fight with the strength of his own arm, and with the sword of Laban. And the strength of the Lord they did contend against their enemies, until they had slain many thousands of the Lamanites. And it came to pass that they did contend against the Lamanites until they had driven them out of the lands of their inheritance. That's verses 13 and 14. In the book of Omni, Amaleki gives a brief account of the same war. I have seen in the days of King Benjamin a serious war and much bloodshed between the Nephites and the Lamanites. But behold, the Nephites did obtain much advantage over them, yea, insomuch that King Benjamin did drive them out of the land of Zarahemla. That's 124 of Omni. In these accounts, both Mormon and Amaleki describe the Nephites driving out the Lamanites from the Nephites' land with their superior strength or advantage. However, Mormon also notes Benjamin's personal role in the combat and his wielding of the sword of Laban in defense of his people, evoking the earlier imagery of Nephi's defensive conquest of the Nephite promised land. That's 2 Nephi 5:14. See chapter 10 as well, that we read earlier. After describing Benjamin's military conflict with the invading Lamanites, Mormon returns to the previously mentioned internal contention among the Nephites. Quote, "And it came to pass that after there had been false Christs," ooh, that would be an interesting one. That would have been a really good chapter to have, to try and see what was specifically meant by false Christs. See how they operated. Dang. Anyways, to continue the quote, "And it came to pass that there had been false Christs, and their mouths had been shut, and they punished according to their crimes. And after there had been false prophets and false preachers and teachers among the people, and all these having been punished according to their crimes, and after there having been much contention and many dissensions away unto the Lamanites, behold, it came to..." Oh, there was dissensions unto the Lamanites too. "Behold, it came to pass that King Benjamin, with the assistance of the holy prophets, who were among his people, for behold, King Benjamin was a holy man, and he did reign over his people in righteousness, and there were many holy men in the land, and they did speak the words of God with power and authority, and they did use much sharpness because of the stiff-neckedness of the people. Wherefore, with the help of these, King Benjamin, by laboring with all the might of his body and the faculty of his whole soul, and also the prophets, did once more establish peace in the land." That's Words of Mormon 1:15-18. Ooh, that would explain a lot of internal contention. Because if you've got a bunch of people that are following after different false Christs, I mean, how did they convince people of that? Like, they knew the time frame. That was established long before. It was going to be 600 years after Lehi left Jerusalem. They knew it, and they stuck to their guns. And that's why it was, like, so precise when they, like, knew that Jesus Christ was coming into the world, that they'd get the sign in the heavens that they were told about. Yeah. So, this describes a spiritual conflict that in many ways paralleled the military conflict that preceded it. Benjamin throws himself forcefully into each conflict, fighting with the strength of his own arm against the physical threat, and laboring with all the might of his body and faculty of his whole soul against the spiritual threat. The resolution of the military conflict against an external adversary and the spiritual conflict against an internal adversary share the exact same structure, and Benjamin triumphs in them by variations on the same two means. First, he wields an incisive weapon with his full personal strength, the sword against the Lamanite invaders, and speaking with power and authority, wields another weapon, the word against false. All we need is to add an S at the front, I'm just saying. But anyways, the word against the false Christs, false prophets, and false preachers and teachers. Second, he joins with allies by gathering his armies against the military threat and working with true prophets against the spiritual threat. At the end of both conflicts, the victory is the same, with Benjamin restoring peace in the land. These two parallel conflicts, waged by Benjamin, are the likely subjects of the missing first two chapters of the book of Mosiah/Benjamin. Footnote, Jack Lyon and Kent Minson have asked how the conclusion of Benjamin's conflicts in the Words of Mormon is able to bring narrative so precisely to where the book of Mosiah 1:1 picks up when Joseph resumes translating after the theft. Intriguingly, they argue that Joseph Smith retained a portion of the initial translation or manuscript prior to Mosiah 1:1, and that Joseph added this translation remnant to the Words of Mormon as verses 12-18 to bridge a narrative gap between the small plates and where Mosiah 1:1 picked up. I critique the proposition of a retained portion as an anachronistic reading of Doctrine and Covenants 10:41 in chapter 5, note 10. I would add that it's uncharacteristic of Mormon to offer only a terse summary of these intensive conflicts. Such summary treatment better fits the context of the small plates in which the verses actually appear and where they appear to belong. As Brant Gardner notes, Quote, Mormon's descriptions of events do not have this level of terseness until 4th Nephi. These verses describe nothing short of the crucial events that led up to Benjamin's speech. They deal with an external war with the Lamanites, an internal civil war, and religious crisis. Compare the treatment in this synopsis with similar topics in the Book of Alma. These are things that Mormon cares about deeply. That was the end of the quote. Further, clashing with Lyon and Minson's hypothesis, there is no evidence that Joseph Smith helped Oliver Cowdery understand and arrange this part of the manuscript, and Oliver's demonstrable confusion over it, or demonstrable. Yeah, demonstrable. It's easier to say demonstrable. But demonstrable confusion over it, noted by Lyon and Minson and described in the note 5 above, suggests that Joseph did not. Oliver's confusion over chapter 3 suddenly appearing in the manuscript is understandable when, 1, we recognize that it would have been Martin Harris, per D&C 530, not Oliver, who was the scribe for that chapter, and 2, we understand Oliver to be arranging this material without Joseph's supervision. Yet, the question raised by Lyon and Minson is incisive. I will offer my own explanation of the Words of Mormon summary and Benjamin's conflicts and its unexplained duplication of Omni 124 in future work. See Jack M. Lyon and Kent R. Minson, When Pages Collide, Dissecting the Words of Mormon, and Gardner's When Hypotheses Collide. Interesting. So, wow. Like I said, these guys are digging deep into this stuff. And that big, huge footnote was just all about the two parallel conflicts waged by Benjamin being likely the subjects of the first 2 chapters of the book of Mosiah / Benjamin. So, wow. Maybe it's because I don't want to think too deeply. Maybe because I think Don Bradley is actually a really even-headed, kind of even-keel guy, that it's likely that instead of retaining a little portion and then kind of bridging the narrative, that it just actually fits. But, I look forward to what comes of that. Anyway, who knows if I'll ever find it or get to it, but chapters in the original Book of Mormon text were typically twice as long as chapters in the present-day Latter-day Saints edition, were divided along narrative units, with a single chapter generally providing a cohesive narrative. The 2 narratives of conflict from Benjamin's early reign would have thus nicely mapped onto the missing 2 chapters of Benjamin's book. If these 2 narratives of conflict, one military, one spiritual, correspond with the 2 missing chapters, then the opening words of chapter 3, our Mosiah 1 through 2, pick up precisely where chapter 2 left off. After chapter 2's conclusion with Benjamin's victory in the spiritual contention among his people in the land of Zarahemla, the opening verse of chapter 3 would provide a perfect segue into the succeeding narrative. And now there was no more contention in all the land of Zarahemla among all the people who belonged to King Benjamin, Mosiah 1:1. This suggests that the conflict concluded at the end of chapter 2. This suggests that the conflict concluded at the end of chapter 2 was not the serious war between the Nephites and Lamanites, but the spiritual contention that occurred among Benjamin's people. The expeditions to the land of Nephi. Oh, yes. This section. Further clues to the contents of these lost chapters of this book appear at the end of the Book of Omni. Amaleki, the last keeper of Jacob's line, ends the Book of Omni as follows. Quote, And now I would speak somewhat concerning a certain number who went up into the wilderness to return to the land of Nephi. For there was a large number who were desirous to possess the land of their inheritance. Wherefore they went up into the wilderness, and their leader being a strong and mighty man, a stiff-necked man, wherefore he caused a contention among them, and they were all slain, save 50, in the wilderness, and they returned again to the land of Zarahemla. And it came to pass that they also took others to a considerable number, and took their journey again into the wilderness. And I, Amaleki, had a brother who also went with them, and I have not since known concerning them. And I am about to lie down in my grave, and these plates are full, and I make an end of my speaking. Omni 1, 27-30. How do these expeditions relate to the war and spiritual contention among Benjamin's people? And where do they fall within the first 2 chapters of Benjamin's reign? The accounts of the Book of Omni and Words of Mormon provide clues. First, in describing the war that likely comprised the first chapter, Mormon begins, and it came to pass also that the armies of the Lamanites came down out of the land of Nephi. That's Words of Mormon 1:13. The detail that the Lamanite armies came upon Zarahemla out of the land of Nephi is significant for relating this account to the expeditions mentioned by Amaleki. Describing the same expeditions, Zeniff later recounts that the second expedition was successful, resulting in the Lamanite king giving Zeniff's people the land of Nephi, which then they settled and successfully held against Lamanite attack. That's Mosiah 9-10. After this expedition, the land of Nephi was consistently held by Nephite settlers. Thus, an attack involving Lamanites coming down from the land of Nephi would necessarily precede the Zeniff expedition. Ooh, interesting. Footnote to that. Note Amaleki's presentation of the events in the same order. The war, Omni 1:24, and then the colonizing expeditions. That's 1:27-29. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Second, the colonizing expeditions are connected to the war by a golden thread, the theme of lands of inheritance. The war began with the Lamanites attacking out of the land of Nephi, Words of Mormon 1:13, and ended with the Lamanites being driven out of the land of Zarahemla. That's Omni 1:24. Mormon takes this further. The Nephites did contend against the Lamanites until they had driven them out of all the lands of their inheritance. Words of Mormon 1:14. This sequence implies probable causal relationships. The Lamanite attack from the Nephites' original southern land of inheritance, Nephi, led to the Lamanites being driven out of the Nephites' present northern lands of inheritance, Zarahemla, and back to the lands of Nephi, with the Nephites having clear military superiority and the Lamanites having been weakened. Some Nephites now wished to press their advantage, countering the Lamanites' failed conquest of Zarahemla and extermination of the Nephites. And this would explain a lot. Well, let me finish what he's talking about. The first expedition attempted a conquest of the land of Nephi and extermination of the Lamanites, Mosiah 9:1. This comprised chapter 1 of Benjamin's reign, a chapter focused entirely on the struggles of lands of inheritance, narrating 1, the attempted Lamanite conquest, 2, the attempted Nephite counter-conquest, and 3, the second expedition to re-inherit the land of Nephi, this time non-violently. So, I don't know if he's about to get into this or not, but to me, part of these conquests and such is the resettling of the land of Nephi comes down to Zeniff, and then later King Noah, Abinadi, and Alma. And to me, this is, like, that's how I always tied them together, because I was like, oh, it's so cool. They went up there, and then there was only 50 that came back because they fought amongst themselves, which was really crappy of them to do. And that's why only 50 survived. And then Zeniff comes back, grabs more people, and says, let's go, and let's do this. And they're doing it non-violently. Well, it makes sense. What if the Nephites, because I always wondered, like, were the Lamanites just really trying to be tricksy and say, yeah, go ahead and re-inherit your lands and we'll get them later? Because, yeah, that was kind of their plan, sure. And they mention that in the Book of Mormon, but at the same time, why even give them that land in the first place? That always was kind of like a, I'll think about it later thing. But if it was that the Lamanites were just beaten horrifically, and they knew that they'd been beaten horrifically, and here they are, you have this Nephite army coming, and they're like, we want to take over the land peacefully. We won't kill you for it, but let us have it. And they're like, sure. It's like they're probably trying to make the best of a bad situation, which is the idea that they probably feel the sting of their last defeat very badly, and then are going, yeah, they could probably kill us all, so let's let them have this land, and then we'll come back and take it later. I bet you that's what it was. So let's continue on with what Don Bradley is saying. Chapter 2 then narrated spiritual contentions. Oh yeah, he just skips over it. So, Chapter 2 then narrated spiritual contentions in the land of Zarahemla. This narrative, like the narrative of war and expeditions comprising Chapter 1, was complex and included multiple conflicts. The first was with a false Christ or Christs, ending with them having their mouths shut and being punished according to their crimes. Both these elements appear again in Alma's conflict with one person Mormon calls an antichrist in his extant abridgment, Korihor. That's Alma 30, 6, 9 through 12, and 47 through 52. So, to me, the problem is there's a difference between false Christs and antichrists, but we'll see what he has to say. In his extant abridgment, Korihor, Alma 30, 6 through 9, Alma 30, verse 6, and also 9 through 12, and 47 through 52, possibly suggesting a similar one-on-one conflict between Benjamin, who prefigures the true Christ, and a false Christ. See Words of Mormon 1:15. This is followed by conflicts with false prophets, in which a number of true prophets assist Benjamin, verses 16 and 18, from Words of Mormon. In the midst of all this are also many dissensions away unto the Lamanites, indicating that internal cohesion within the Nephite community is restored in part by dissent being put down, and also in part by dissidents leaving. See verse 16. The chapter then concluded with the restoration of peace, setting the stage for Mosiah 1:1, in which there was no more contention, and also previously it means no more contention among all the people who were King Benjamin's, if you remember those quotes from earlier. And that makes more sense, because if the dissidents left, they left. So to me, that's very indicative of, oh, that is interesting. I got something that Don Bradley didn't put in his book, which is a good thing. I mean, I figure that's probably makes sense. They got their butt beaten. Lamanites give up the land so that they inherit Nephi. The Lamanites sit there and think, well, we're going to make it a trap. And they did. All right, summaries of the missing chapters. The apparent structure for the missing 2 chapters of Benjamin's reign in the book that may have borne his name is thus. Chapter 1, War and Expeditions for the Lands of Inheritance, a fuller version of the events of Omni 124 and Words of Mormon 1:13 through 14. Chapter 2, Contentions for Souls, Benjamin and the Prophets against the false messiahs and false prophets, a fuller version of the events of Words of Mormon 1:12 and verses 15 through 18. As one Book of Mormon scholar noted, the Book of Mosiah is possibly the most carefully composed book in the Book of Mormon. The footnote for that is Gordon C. Thompson's Mosiah, the complex symbolism and symbolic complex of kingship in the Book of Mormon. Thus, understanding its opening chapters may help us better understand that complexity and glean the book's overall message. Benjamin and Messianic expectations. It's important to note that Benjamin's settling of this contention that began with false Christs was the final narrative of the lost manuscript before it was stolen. The theme behind this conflict is thus one of messianic expectation, as discussed in chapter 14. Benjamin's father, Mosiah I, was a proto-messianic figure, or precursor of the Messiah, as a prophet, priest, and king, a deliverer, lawgiver, and shepherd. Mosiah I pointed his people to the Messiah, who was yet to come, thus stoking messianic hope and expectation. Given that their own king was a powerful prototype of the Messiah, It's possible that Mosiah the first's people would have not only expected the Messiah, but had expected him soon. This raises a question. Did some of this messianic expectation get centered on Mosiah the first's own son in the missing narrative? Benjamin, like his father, and each ancient high priest, as Alma explained, served as a similitude of the Messiah, a finger pointing the people to him. But what if the people confused the pointing finger to that to which it pointed? This would account for why Benjamin would feel the need to quash any suspicions that he himself was the divine Messiah by opening his sermon to his people with the declaration, "I of myself am a mortal man, and am like yourselves, subject to all manner of infirmities in body and mind." Mosiah 2:10-11. Ooh, and the same fervent hope that the Messiah was at hand that led some to embrace false Christs could have led others among Benjamin's people to suspect that a successor to Mosiah the first, who had pointed them to the Christ, Benjamin was that true Christ. Ooh, which could also mean that that's probably what was being taught by those false Christs. The challenge confronting Benjamin then was to keep his people focused on active faith in the Christ to come, without prematurely fixing that hope on a false Messiah, to point them beyond the finger, the symbol, and the symbol, and to the substance to which it led. Taking up the sword of Laban his father had delivered to him to defend his people, the young King Benjamin carried on a legacy that stretched back to Nephi, and before him to the patriarch Joseph, Benjamin's own forefather, and the brother of his biblical namesake. In taking up the word of God with power and authority, young Benjamin taught his people God's word on the brass plates. Again, a legacy of Joseph. God's word on the golden plates, a legacy of Nephi, and God's word of continuing revelation through the Spirit, and also through the interpreters, a legacy of his father. In all this, Benjamin perpetuated and extended Mosiah the First's reform, and pointed the minds of the people of Mosiah forward to their Messiah. See Mosiah 1:10. And that's it. There is the last chapter of this book, conclusion, insights from what was found. Yeah, I don't have enough time today for that, so we'll do that next time. But, okay, big things I learned. I gotta find a good spot for this to sit down. There we go. Things I specifically learned from the missing chapters of the book of Benjamin. Maybe Mosiah. From those last chapters. The huge conflict came first before the expeditions to fight and conquer the Lamanites. That's interesting. And that explains why the Lamanites would be like, yeah, okay, we'll give up the land of Nephi. It wasn't just to be tricksy. It was probably because they thought they really couldn't win. They had been beaten so badly and their numbers were so low that they were like, yes, let's do what you want. And then we'll try and come back and get them. And, for a couple of generations, that did not work. Like under Zeniff, and I think they had like 2 conflicts under Zeniff. And they were beaten back, and it didn't work. And then under King Noah, they came again, and boy howdy, they got them. And that's how they became under, I think it was Limhi? Need to remember these names? I remember Amaleki. Amalekiah is the really, really bad guy, because he has lick in the name. I'll try to remember it, darn it. But, the son of King Noah, he was under condemnation and captivity. Well, Alma and his group left just before the invasion. Then the Lamanites invade, and that eventually, Gideon runs up the tower trying to kill King Noah. Noah's like, oh crap, they're invading, and so he runs off, and him and his priests, and then the priests turn against King Noah, burn him in the wilderness, and then the priests become a thorn in the side of Alma's group, whereas back in the original land of Nephi, I think it's King Limhi, who's now stuck with being under the rule of the Lamanites and having to give grievous taxes. They go up against them 2 or 3 more times and totally get whooped badly. And that's when the expedition from Zarahemla to figure out, hey, what happened to everybody, arrives. And they deliver them. Anyway. It's just, wow, that makes so much more sense. But, oh God, I really wish we had those chapters on the false Christs. I really do. Because we have a couple of good chapters about antichrists, which are kind of like those who are atheists or preachers to get gain, like after the Order of Nahor, and that we still have in the Book of Mormon. But the actual false Christs, because there's a few that are in the world. Like, I know that there was one in Russia that, he was born under this name, etc., and then he's gotten a gathering and he calls himself Christ. But the problem is like, he obviously does not fit everything that's expected about Jesus Christ coming again, which is coming in great glory and all sorts of stuff. But it makes me wonder, like, how many, I would love to have had that pattern to see what were those false Christs teaching, because it would make it easier to sit there and say, oh, that person is trying to be a false Christ. Just like you can point out people who are antichrists, that they literally are against Jesus Christ, his teachings, believing he exists, whatever else. They just literally do anything and everything they can to be very vindictive against Jesus Christ and his believers. And you see that exact same pattern in modern days. But I'm wondering about the false Christs. That's just a fascinating one, because we've been told that in, what is it, Revelations? I need to look it up again. God, there's so much to reference. But the idea that there would be false Christs and it would deceive many, including some of the best ones. So I'm just sitting here going, it would have been a good pattern to have and hold. But it makes me wonder, like chicken egg thing, where if it is in there and people know about it, does that give them the pattern that they can follow to deceive people? So there would have been more of them, but it also means that we would have had the pattern to avoid them. Or would it just have been good to have? Because whether or not it was given and people were influenced by it, it would at least give us the pattern to say, hey, this person is acting as if they are Christ and they are not. On the other hand, with how, all the prophecies are about the second coming, it's like, if you don't see those signs, So anyways, we will see. It's just a fascinating thought to me. We're right near the end, and then I'll just start picking up with in the language of Adam. And we'll just see the titles of my videos start changing. Well, love you lots. Hopefully you're still enjoying Disneyland and you don't get too sick on the teacups. Or anything else. I hope they get to really enjoy the Haunted Mansion. And I'm trying to think of all the other ones that would be just wonderful for them to enjoy. Oh, I don't think they have the blasters. I think that's Disney World. The Toy Story blasters. That was so cool. I love all the pictures you're giving us. And I'm so glad they're having fun. And you enjoy yourselves. We'll see ya.